My name's Ali Vogel from Flexi, and today we are here with Dor Tal. Dor is a design lead from Gong, and we're going to have a really interesting conversation about the evolution of what it actually means to design for AI-centric products, as Dor has really been at the nascent stages of what it means to work on a product that has AI at its core. So, Dort, thank you so much for being here today on our podcast, Flexible by Design.
Thank you for inviting me, Ali.
So, just for a little background here, Dor and I actually worked together back at Booking.com. He was based in the Netherlands and then moved back to Tel Aviv. So, he has a lot of international experience. Dor, I would love to hear from your own words a little bit about your career and what brought you to where you are today at Gong.
A little bit about myself. So as you mentioned, these days I'm working at Gong, which is basically, we used to call it a startup, but it's pretty big already. We're like 1,200. It's a company building product, which is basically a revenue AI platform that helps sales organization to optimize all of their processes with the AI. But actually, we were there pretty long time ago. Before I joined Gong like 4 years ago. Before that, as you mentioned, I worked for Booking.com in Amsterdam. I led the team there as well. And before that, I worked in a small startup in Tel Aviv. We built a pretty awesome small product about IoT, Internet of Things. That was, again, big thing back then. And I think it's going to come back really soon. But it was a platform for building IoT products.
I remember meeting you back in Amsterdam, and you were working in a pretty traditional environment, we can call it. Booking.com has been around for 20 years. They basically do, for, everyone who lives under a rock here and doesn't know Booking.com, a travel platform that allows you to book hotels and now experiences and some flights and rental cars as well. That was a traditional e-commerce company. And since you've shifted into a company which really ahead of its time in terms of using AI as the core of the product. So can you tell me a little bit about that transition from going to a more traditional e-commerce company to, now it's almost obvious, right? Like everyone is using AI, but at the time when you started 5 years ago, this was pretty novel. So tell me a little bit about that shift and what were some of the things you had to adjust or learn upon starting at Gong?
Actually, it's a funny story. I recall when the recruiter called me from Gong, and I was still based in Amsterdam, and she was like, "I have something really interesting to tell you about." And I was like, "What you guys are building there?" And she was like, "It's a product for salespeople." And I was like, "Me in sales? I don't think so. I'm coming from the traveling domain, and sales, it's really not, didn't sound anything exciting." And she told me, wait, before you're like moving on, hear more about it. It's not a usual sales platform. And I was like, okay, I'm willing to hear. And then I recall she set up a meeting with Elon, which is one of our co-founders. And he was like, back then he was still doing demos for all candidates. They were pretty big. So anyway, we set up a call, and he just demoing product for me. And I was like amazed. It's back then the language model that Gong used was top of the line. It was like transcripting every calls and analyzing topics on the spot, and it just showed me, and it blown my mind. And I was like, okay, it's not just a sales platform. It's really AI. And again, we're talking about 6 years ago, 5 years ago, when the call was, AI wasn't huge. Again, also in Booking, we already had some AI. Actually, in Tel Aviv was the development center. It was there, but it was mostly about recommendations and all of those engines. Netflix was big back then. But starting to transform language, natural language, into insights, into something that people can work with, was pretty new, and I was really excited about this opportunity. But back then we already had like a huge department of natural language engineers, and it was something that Gong was really working hard on. So for me, it was really, super exciting, and the yes was pretty short from there.
I remember when I worked at Booking, which again is how we met, and I was in the machine learning development center. I never heard about LLMs, and I worked really, really closely with the engineering team there. but we were using these different recommendation engines, like you said, and it was helpful, but it wasn't a necessity like it's become today in core product development. Today, you don't really hear about AI companies unless it's like infrastructurally AI. Otherwise, AI is an obvious application of what we're doing just to help us streamline processes and make sure that we're the most efficient and effective using products. But from what you're describing, Gong was really at the core of this. And this was 5 or 6 years ago. So when you saw this and you looked at, where you were currently working or what you had worked on in the past, what were some of the initial thoughts that you had? Did you ever think it would become as mainstream and as adopted as it's become in the last 2 or 3 years?
I think first, it's a great question. Again, I was really impressed by the technology and the capabilities. And again, we weren't the first one. I think it's the phase where this technology become mature enough for actual apps to use it. There was Amazon and Facebook were already in the game back then. So there were a few models that provided some infrastructure. Also, all the personal assistant Siri and Alexa started. Suddenly people could talk to their devices and the device could understand. I think the explosion we're experiencing, it's don't know even if OpenAI could think that it's going to be that big, right? It's like it changed everything, and suddenly, everyone, the sentence I hear all the time is like, now everyone can build Gong, which I think it's more of an illusion or a sense that people
Mm.
feels. But yeah, true. The technology become much more accessible and people can actually use it and touch it. I don't think I was expecting that explosion, but it's also something amazing that Gong is experiencing.
So let's deep dive a little bit more into what you just said, that everyone can build Gong, which is a pretty big statement considering that when you started there 5 or 6 years ago, the technology was really driving the product. And it was one of the things that gave the product such a competitive advantage. So from your perspective and where you're sitting and where you have seen this evolution really firsthand, what do you think are some of the most pressing threats to product development at Gong and where it needs to go?
As you mentioned at the beginning, it's much easier to explain today what Gong does, and I think it's powerful, and it's helping the business. Also, the moment of the explosion, Gong was positioned in a place when we were like best positioned for that. We have knowledge, we have the expertise, so everything there was like nothing new. Also for us, things become easier. We could really leverage the velocity that things are moving. We were really set up for that, but today I'm much more certain that we're like in a better position due to the revolution and not in a worse position.
So you've really seen product development accelerate at Gong as a result of
Sure.
this. And do you feel that you are ahead of your competitors having so much domain knowledge? Or do you think today, because of all of the information that's available and, that easy output of product development because of vibe coding and all these additional tools, that your position, not your position as Dor, but your position as a company is potentially at risk because of what is now accessible?
Again, in the vibe coding and all of this, I'm putting aside for a second. Like, I don't think it's still something that we can really predict or understand or whatever. But the LLM advancement, the models advancement, progression, I think it's something that the entire industry is experiencing elevation and evolution. So I think like we're part of it, and I think also in several areas as leaders as well.
Mhm.
And also I think some personal thoughts. It's that it's really hard to predict those things. I think the revolution now is so big. It's like being there in the early 2000s and say like what's going to be now with the internet. I don't know what's going to be. I do know that we're PayPal.
Yeah, and like you said, there are these legacy companies, not to say Gong is legacy, it's only, 5 or 6 years old, but there is something to being a first mover. And from the research that I've done about Gong, it seems like you have such a vast customer base. You've become such a leader in the industry that if the leadership team is quick to adopt to these new technological advancements, if anything, this will really position you super well because now your value proposition isn't just, oh, we're hiding AI in the background, but we are an AI first company and actually have been since our inception.
True, exactly.
So let's talk a little bit about you as a design leader. So you had mentioned you were leading a team at Booking.com. And now, if I understand correctly, you're leading a team at Gong as well. Can you tell me a little bit more about your leadership role at Gong, how that's evolved, and how you're actually thinking about potentially bringing AI not just to core product development, but into your workflows?
So I will split the answer to two. First about, the leadership and design organization in general at Gong, and secondly about the AI part of it. So firstly, I was like the fifth designer at Gong, and as a principal or, as a value, we're a really flat company. So there's no much hierarchy happening. Currently, we have like designers, we have myself and three more design managers.
How is it to lead a team of designers that are working on a product that has AI at its core, as opposed to some of the other experience you had prior? Do you see differences? Do you have to work with different workflows, different principles?
So firstly, I think the structure of the teams is very different. The team I led back then in Booking was a mixture of designers and developers as well. In Booking, team leaders lead like the entire team, while in Gong, I lead a team of designers, which each designer has their own pod they're working with. So actually the touch with the designer is lower, like the day-to-day touch is lower, yet the craft is similar. So I think it's a different approach. Product wise, I think again, each product is different. I don't think like the core principles of how designers work is different. I think it's like, the processes are pretty similar. I think that what we're seeing today, with the transition of tools, I remember back then in Booking, there was the transition from Sketch to Figma. It was a change, something moved there, and there was a top adoption phase where everyone needed to learn something new, but it was first of all, it was pretty similar. And secondly, the movement wasn't that dramatic as now that we're seeing like those new tools that really reshaping the design process. And I think it's regardless to the company. I believe that all product companies are now experiencing it, like rather they're like AI first companies or like more traditional, just SaaS product or any digital product companies, because I think again the tooling for designers are changing, and I think it's cross industry. I don't believe it's something very unique at Gong, although we're like touching with more with AI, so we're both using an AI and building AI as well. Yet again, I think the processes are like drastically changing nowadays for everyone, not just.
So let's double down into that because I know a lot of people are really interested in what top companies are using in terms of their design workflows. So, what are some of the tools specifically that your team has adopted AI wise?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think it's like it's moving rapidly these days, and things what we're discussing now, I believe that in a few weeks will be completely different. And there's a huge discussion happening also internally now. We have those thinking brainstorm tanks, to think about like which tools do we want to adopt. And there's a lot of noise and buzz around those tools. What I can see is like, first of all, there's a lot of excitement. People are excited about these tools, and I think the excitement is in both ends. There are a bad excitement. People are like in a FOMO, feels like everything it's running so fast, and they're like can't handle all those changes. And on the other hand, you have the more early adopters or people that are more excited about the new opportunities. I personally find myself a bit more to this side. I'm really excited about this. I think there's a lot of new opportunities. And again, what I'm seeing very interesting is we still don't have like a structured process to work with all of those new tools. So we're still adapting, and we're a big enough company for things to move a bit slower than a small startup. So we need to make sure that everything is compliant and secured. But I do see with one-on-one with my designers that they're just using those tools. They're coming to a meeting and just showing me a prototype they created in Lovable, using some dummy data or whatever, and not using our interface, but just to prototype a certain behaviors and they want to demonstrate or to test. And I think what's interesting is to see just it's everyone. Everyone are just getting to those meetings with those tools, and everyone are really trying to use them. And maybe it's not about trying. I think they're seeing the value. And I think what's exciting is to see that it's coming from the field. It's not something that the management is saying, start using this, but you see also it's coming from down, like
People are actually at like they're using it. They're themselves
yeah,
adopting and
and
bringing
they're
it to you.
demanding, they're really demanding to help those. So as a company, you don't have a real choice because we will tell you, I want those tools and do whatever needed to make it compliant. So I
Wow.
think if we always discuss product-led growth, I think it's prime. It's like you can see it, people just, the end users are begging for it to happen and really pushing, and you can see it all across. Also in the engineering, engineers don't accept anymore to code without it, right? It's something that just don't do anymore.
If I'm understanding this correctly, is actually pushing you and demanding of you that the adoption move quicker and more in line with where the industry is going. You mentioned Lovable as one of the tools, and of course, it seems like Lovable blew up overnight in the sense that just a few months ago, people didn't know what it was, and today, even in a large enterprise company like Gong, and I think at this point we can call it more of an enterprise company, there are people, designers internally that are adopting this tool and actually demanding of management of like, hey, we need to make this compliant so that we can use it. And who knows, maybe they're even using it without making it compliant, but like you see the need and the push internally to make this happen. So that actually goes into another question I have about this large argument in the industry regarding designers becoming obsolete, right? Like all these founders now are like, I can use Lovable, I can create UI. And by the way, I've seen what they're building and it looks pretty bad, but hey, if they feel empowered by using the tools, like all power to them, and it will get better in fairness. Like the tools are just so rapidly improving. But it's really interesting to see how your designers are actually pushing and leading this initiative and using it as a companion as instead of a competitor. So what would you say is the general philosophy of you as a leader when it comes to helping your designers adopt these tools and you yourself actually being at the forefront of leading through example, using AI in your workflows and encouraging your team and supporting your team to do so?
I'm trying to facilitate the most constructive process for them. And I think that, it's big, it's exciting, yet is a process, and it's something that, you can somehow manage. And I think, we're trying to see the value of those tools, and definitely I'm all about adopting and growing and learning new stuff. So I think I'm definitely on this side of things, trying to facilitate this learning and growth. Also, to deal with the noise. I think there's a lot of noise, and I feel that I need to protect the team from all that noise and FOMO and people, there's so many new terms, we wake up one morning and there's MCPs everywhere, and everyone like, okay, now I need to use MCP, but where, why?
What is an MCP?
I think it's a trending buzzword. It's basically some kind of an API for LLMs. It's a way,
Okay.
for instance, what I tested was to connect Unity, which is a game building engine, to LLM. So it's basically letting you use Claude or OpenAI or whatever to speak to an API, which it's powerful, definitely. But I think again, I think that what's happening is that you're opening LinkedIn, you open, any newsletter, and there's a new buzzword that's, now it's changing everything. And the changes are real. There is a lot of changes happening, but some
Mhm.
of them are noise. And going back to my role, I think it's to manage somehow a process where I can reduce the noise for the team and for myself, for the organization, to see with all of those things happen, where's the value, what we can
Mhm.
really benefit from adopting, and what is just another noise in this domain, which again, I'm not always successful, but I think this is, what a manager can do in this change management process.
And how do you see the role of a designer evolving, right? There's a lot of, you talked about fear and there's a lot of concern and FOMO and all these emotions that are stirring in a lot of technical people's mind, which is like, okay, if anyone can use these tools and if AI is evolving at such a rapid pace that, yeah, today the landing page that the founder of XYZ startup created is functioning, but not so great. Maybe in 6 months, this will actually be great. And as a designer, specifically in an enterprise company like Gong, which in itself, people are starting to challenge, like, hey, we can build our own Gong, we can build more competitors. What is the general sentiment of the team, and how do you actually see the role of a designer evolving specifically as all these changes are happening?
It's like in many technological revolutions, there's always fear with that, and people immediately trying to protect their current craft or role. I think that again, if you look on the history, and it's not me, I'm not very original with this perspective, but I truly believe in it. It's always when you look back and you see what really happened is that craft has evolved to something better. There's always these examples from the ATMs, that people were afraid, but it freed more time and brain power for people to leverage and to do greater stuff. And I truly believe that if designers could triple, 10 times their pace of design, just by telling Figma what to draw quickly and to explore more ideas, I think it's gonna turn them into better designers, not gonna take their job.
And this is something we've already seen, right? Because even 15, well, maybe a little more than that, like 20, 25 years ago, the way in which we learned design, the principles were the same, right? But the tools we were using were very different. I remember when I was studying, we were using Photoshop and we were using Illustrator, and there were no smart tools. And you really had to learn the tools super well to be able to do these really basic functions that now anyone can do. So we see it today. And I always like to say, like, just because you can use Canva, like, it doesn't make you a designer. And I love when I see people, they get so excited and they're like, look what I made on Canva. And it's like, wow, you used a template and it still looks like that. Like, okay, like we know why people learn principles of design, right? And so my hot take on the whole revolution that we're going through right now is that the really exceptional designers, the ones that can think, that can lead, that can explore a lot of different options and really think about the end user, those people are going to thrive. And they're going to be able to leverage all these tools, whether it be themselves or the teams that they're leading, kind of like you mentioned, as one of your core functions at Gong, to be more productive, successful, to ship faster, to ship higher quality, to ship with more knowledge instead of all the variables that when we're designing today, we don't always know as what's possible, what's not technologically speaking. But now, because we have that information, we can prototype, we can look for different samples of data that are more readily available. We're going to be more exceptional in the craft. And those that can adopt and those that are curious will lead.
Others will find their way, right? It's like true also for these days as well, right? The people that know how to think deeply, that understand the user, that understand the design principles, are already thriving. Again, it's going to be a different environment, but I think the core skills are still super important, and will determine who will thrive and who's not.
What would you say is your most controversial opinion on using AI today?
I do believe that programming as it is today, it's gonna vanish quickly, and I also think it's gonna be quicker than we thought.
Do you think it's going to be quicker than design?
In the past few months, I hear a different tone. I hear a different tone. Suddenly things are changing, and I see also the results. It's really hard to predict. Again, the startup I mentioned was based on 3D printing, and we felt like we were on the verge of explosion, and it never happened. Maybe we are on the verge here. I do believe it's going to be much sooner than we think.
What would you say of all of the tools that you're using in your workflow that are AI based is the one thing that you can't live without?
I think that none of them is mature enough. I think that all of them are in a different maturity level, but none of them is it's still like a professional tool. I personally use mostly Cursor. I do feel very comfortable in a code environment,
And
and I
can
do
you
like
tell
the
the audience what Cursor is for those that don't know?
Cursor. It's basically a code agent that sits on VS Code, and basically you can prompt anything and it will modify the code, and it has several features. It's also like can write code within the code editors. It's basically code writing agent. I feel comfortable, and I think it's giving me more flexibility than those more structured like Lovable and Base 44 that are like more like one prompt, and what you get is what you find with design system. And so here I can build stuff as I used to, because again, I used to build projects with code. So now it's just easier and more flexible. Cursor is my go-to.
You see designers on your team adopting it as well,
I
even the
think again,
non-technical ones?
so cursor, no, it's still not. Although again, there's no real reason, because again, it's just a shell. All of those lovable stuff, it's a shell on top of those tools that are a shell on other stuff. But so it's just a level of how comfortable you feel with, removing the shell and touching the actual bones. And this one, I truly believe that I will try, to get my team comfortable with those tools. So we're now running some workshops together, taking a feature and trying to restructure it or to build it, using different tools to model it. And I do see that people are curious. They're a bit frightened when they see like code, all those scary words, but first of all, you can hide it. You don't have to use it. I mentioned, I think that for core work, those tools are still not there. They're like supporting some processes. I think that, GPT and Claude and all of these are also great tools for design, for ideation, for, thinking about brainstorming. I don't think it's instead of doing it with people, but when I by myself, I find it pretty useful to have someone to ping pong some ideas with, which is I miss sometimes. But I certainly do see that everyone around me and myself turned from something that you use like once a day, twice a day, to something that people are using like 50% of their day, 80, they, one tool or another, moving from Claude to GPT to some of the prototyping tools. But I think it's become very, very integral part of the job.
I would love if you could share any closing thoughts. So, any message that you have to our audience listening today, either about the work that you're doing or about maybe calming down some of their fears
Mm.
of the designers that think like, oh, maybe my job will cease to exist in the next year. I'm curious if you have any thoughts, any words of inspiration, any message that you want to get out to the audience today.
I think that people need to trust themselves, as always. I know I trust myself to adapt, to learn, to grow, as we always did. So I think that if you trust yourself and come to those opportunities with a certain of excitement instead of fear, I think it can really support. I think that one thing to remove the noise from all of what's happening is to try to take small bites of, practical processes. So for instance, today we're trying, to use the design system to create more states of a component. So you can build an app, you can build Gong. Okay, you can't. But what you can is to work in small pieces and to learn. Maybe this is the most visionary part, to use those processes to learn what those tools can do and cannot do, and how do you can combine them and merge them into your processes, existing processes, and not to try to reshape everything. I think this is, what I'm trying to do, and this is what I can recommend others.
And we're here on the Flexible by Design podcast with Dor Tal, a design lead at Gong, with a lot of great experience from Booking.com and various startups, who is talking to us about what the future of designing with AI looks like, especially from the perspective of someone who's been doing it for quite some time now. Dor, thank you so much for joining us
Thank you for
today.
having me, Ali.